In this video we'll be creating the material for the ninja's clothing, and in the process I'll explain a little bit about roughness. So let's go ahead and isolate that in local view, not that one, that guy, there you go, and go make the material use nodes. Okay, so in our Blender internal file over here, we've got a bunch of textures, and starting from the bottom we have some stitching, which is just going to be, a nice little touch we can add afterwards. Then we've got the main fabric texture, which actually isn't that visible. It's only being shown by 0.2, and it's more affecting the bump mapping. So that's kind of interesting. And then we've got this ambient occlusion over here, which is multiplying over that with 0.5, affecting the diffuse color. So it's kind of just darkening it a bit like regular ambient occlusion. And then we've got this texture over here, which is our cloud texture, and it is kind of just giving us a little bit of dirt on the surface. It is affecting the specular, but we're not really going to bother with that too much. And then we've got the dragon torso over here, and this is basically the stencil overlay that we're going to do afterwards with the dragon pattern on top, just like with the leather we did earlier. And finally we've got this gradient over here. We're not going to bother with this. It's meant to make it darker at the bottom and lighter at the top, which is a pretty good thing to do usually, but for the case of cycles and physically based rendering, we're not really going to bother with that. It's easy to add anyway if you want to. Okay, so it's kind of hard to recreate this material in cycles just by looking at all the values here, because a lot of the time what Lee is doing is adjusting the brightness, the contrast, and the saturation, especially with these ramps and some strange stuff over there. So instead we're just going to try and go for this look in general. So we'll start by adding that texture, which is going to be the image texture, and it is torso fabric diffuse. Alright, and as you can see the UV mapping is wrong as usual. So we just need to connect that and choose the right UV map. Okay, so that is our original torso fabric texture, which isn't actually doing that much. The influence is on 0.2 and the normal is on 0.75. So let's go and connect that to our diffuse BSDF. Whoa. And then mix it together with the color by 0.2. So make that 0.2 and change the color to something. Well, let's start by copying that from the diffuse. But now, I don't really like how plain and gray this color is, and it's not very obvious. So we're going to increase this a little bit so we can see it a bit more. And we're going to change this gray to something with a little bit more color, like a teal sort of color, and maybe a little bit darker. And that's nice. So the next thing to do would be to mix the ambient occlusion texture, which is going to be pretty much exactly the same thing as this texture, and doing the regular ambient occlusion mixing that you would always do in the compositor. So we'll just multiply it over like that. And you can see that's now added some nice shapes in here. Of course, all these dark patches will be invisible underneath the other models, but it gives it a nice edge. Okay, so then the next thing we'll do is the color variation, or the dirt rather, by adding a noise texture, which is here. And let's see what that looks like. Maybe we can increase the scale a little bit. And then of course remap it using a color ramp. And that sort of looks okay. Maybe we should clump these together a little bit nicely. And then change this guy to a dirt color. That looks good. Maybe give it some more density and increase the detail a little bit. And then of course we just need to add this over the original color, like so. And then you can see we've got some dirty patches over there. Maybe 8 is a bit too much. And maybe not. We just need to decrease this a bit. Alright, so it's giving it a little bit of a dirty color, and of course we can reduce that so it's not so visible. Even more. And maybe make this a little more yellowy. Okay, so that's kind of the diffuse color, and we just need to add the stitches, which is going to be another image texture, and it's going to be called torso stitching. And as you can see, it's mostly just a gray thing with some black lines on it. So before we can actually use this, we need to make it a white mostly white with the same black stripes. In fact, we want to make it black with white stripes. So let's go ahead and add a color ramp. Swap these two around first. Oh my god, I hate these handles. Okay, and then just bring this black a little bit further in. Like that. Alright. So now, in order to make these lines sort of like a dashed line, like actual stitches would be, we're going to need a wave texture. Now, wave texture is basically just a sine wave that's kind of stripes, which is pretty cool. And then it's not really mapped very well or very usefully because of all these big areas and stretchiness over here. So we're just going to use the same UV map, and that looks much better. So let's increase our scale to something like 70. Now you see we've got some nice evenly spaced stripes. And then we're going to mix it with our original color over here. Like so. We'll add the wave texture on top like that. And then use the color ramp as the mask. And there you go, we've got some dashed lines. Maybe 70 is a bit too much. And then it's a little bit too bright, so we can of course just reduce this white value over here until we're happy with that. Okay. So that is our diffuse color done. Let's go and connect that. And that's pretty cool. There's actually one more thing I want to do, and that is to make this a little bit more saturated. And to do that, I'm just going to change this to a soft light node and mix black in. And what this basically does is just concentrates the color nicely, gives it some saturation, makes it more rich and darker. I don't really know what it actually does mathematically, but I think it looks cool. So that's kind of our diffuse color done. Let's go ahead and add some reflections. Now, because of the nature of fabrics and that it's got some lines in it, sort of perpendicular lines, a whole bunch of strings, I suppose you could call them, that flow in a certain direction and in a different direction. Rather than just using a glossy shader, let's go ahead and use an anisotropic shader. There we go. Now basically an anisotropic shader is, you probably already know, it's kind of like a glossy shader, but it stretches the reflection or the highlight on a certain axis. And we can change this axis by changing the rotation, which is pretty cool. It's hard to see sometimes because if you put this on, say, 0.5, it'll look pretty much the same. If you put it on 1, it'll still look the same. What you actually want to do is put it between those, like 0.25, and that's going to make it vertical rather than horizontal. Okay, and let's just increase this to completely white, which is cool. And now, let me show you something pretty cool. If I go ahead and increase this roughness to 1, it's sort of starting to look a bit like our diffuse shader, isn't it? It's kind of weird. And the reason for that is because it's not just true for the anisotropic shader, it's also the same for a glossy shader. And the reason for that is because diffuse and specular or glossy are actually the same thing physically. It's just a reflection of light. And the reason we have them separately is just for easier calculations. But basically, if you keep the roughness on 1, it should be pretty similar to what the diffuse should look like. So that's kind of weird, but in our case, we're just going to reduce this a little bit. And that's, you know, that's kind of looks a little bit more like a reflection. But what I also want to do is use the new Ashikman-Shirley distribution, and that's just going to give us a slightly different shape. If I reduce the roughness, you should be able to see the difference a bit better. This is that's a weird name, Ashikman-Shirley, and this is GGX. You can see the GGX is a little bit brighter, it stretches the highlights out a little bit more. And then the Beckman is more like metallic, I like to think. It's got some sharper highlights. Not technically sharper, like less roughness, but it keeps the colors together better. So I'm going to use Ashikman-Shirley because I think when it's on 1, it looks a lot more like a rough diffuse. Speaking of a rough diffuse, if you take a look at our diffuse shader and you increase the roughness to 1, it kind of doesn't seem like it's doing anything. But if you render an image with the diffuse on 0 and the diffuse on 1, and you quickly switch between them, you can actually see that something's changing. And this is basically the same principle as glossy or anisotropic roughness, where it's simulating microfacet details, basically little tiny bumps in the surface. Now, diffuse light is technically rough, glossy light, but it's got this little roughness thing here just to help us make stuff look, well, rough, which is good for clothing. So I'm going to keep the roughness sort of around 0.7 or 0.6 and do exactly the same thing for the anisotropic roughness. So then we can mix these two together and of course use a Fresnel node or a layer weight node, and that is going to be our shader pretty much done. Of course we need to connect that, and that's it. Of course the last thing we need to do is the bump mapping, or the second last thing actually. So we're going to take the original color texture here and just plug it straight into the displacement output like that. It's going to be quite a bit too strong, so we're just going to reduce that, of course, again with a multiply node. 0.5 is probably about right. So you can see it just a little bit. It's more obvious in the places that are having more reflection on the edges, but I think that's working quite nicely. Alright, so that is basically our fabric material done, but the last thing we need to do is add the dragon stencil. So it's going to be exactly the same thing as the shoulder pad. So why not just go ahead and copy paste these nodes. We'll take this, Control C, go back and Control V. There we go. Now what we get out of here, there we go, that's actually the correct texture. I was expecting to have to change the texture, but it's all mapped pretty well already because our default UV map is actually the Dragon UVs, and it's the same texture, so that is pretty cool. And then of course our shader over here, which is just a plain boring white shader that we're going to use to mix together. And then of course we just need to duplicate our mix shader, plug these two together and use that mask. And there we go. And then just like the leather, we're going to make it look a bit like it's coming out of the surface, like it's a separate material that's being printed on. And to do that, we'll just be adding it to the bump map. So let's go and just move this down so it's a little bit more tidy. Maybe add a reroute node here and there, just to keep things a little bit more neat. Alright, and then this is our mask. Okay, and we just need to invert this like so, and then add it to the bump map like so. And that's a little bit too strong maybe, so let's put on 0.1. Or let's actually just look at our leather material just to be consistent. 0.03, and it's being subtracted. Alright, and we didn't invert it, that's why. So, whoops, that guy. Instead of inverting it, we subtract it and make it 0.03. And that should be it. There you go, that looks pretty good. And that is basically our torso material done. So that is pretty cool. And that is the end of this chapter on shading principles. I hope you've learned something and you can apply it by yourself to your own projects and you're not just following me blindly. So in the next chapter we're going to finish off the Ninja by doing a whole bunch of the other materials. I'm not really going to be repeating myself too much, but anyway, we've got some things to finish off, like the rest of the clothing, the side, the eyes, the cornea, the hair, and finally some node groups. And then right at the end, a little bit of rendering optimization.